Today we look at the life of David, and it begins with the call of God on David's life, for David did not come from a royal family. David, the call of God. First, Samuel anoints David as king. Samuel anoints David as king. And here is where we find the famous passage in the Bible that God does not look at outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. Because of King Saul's rebellion, because Saul was more concerned about his agenda rather than God's will, Samuel told King Saul that he was going to go look for a man after God's heart. And so Samuel went to Bethlehem, found the man Jesse, who had many sons, and all of the older sons looked like king material. However, God instructed Samuel to anoint the youngest son, David, as the next king of Israel. Now, at this point, David was still a boy, I'm guessing high school age. So even though he was anointed as king, it was many years before he actually became king. Something that's kind of funny here, not laugh out loud funny, is that Saul was plagued by an evil spirit, and David was an excellent musician, and David winds up in the palace in King Saul's presence, and David plays his harp. David plays his harp to calm King Saul. This is funny because Saul is very bothered that God has left him and no longer values him as king. And who does he find to be his court musician? None other than the one who one day will replace him. Although, of course, Saul does not know this at the time. Next, we move to the famous story of David and Goliath. In this story, the takeaway that I want you to have is David's zeal. Another word for zeal would be passion, David's passion to preserve God's honor. So Goliath, the giant, was not just taunting the soldiers, the army of Israel. He was taunting Israel's God, saying the Philistine God is stronger than your God, and I'll prove it by defeating you. Great courage and faith rose up in David, and in the story, he gathers 5 stones from a brook and goes to face off the giant. He ends up striking the giant, cutting off his head, and winning a great battle for the Israelites that day. In our culture, if an underdog is playing in, say, a sporting contest and the underdog wins, sometimes we call it, this is a great David and Goliath battle and David won. However, really, in this battle, if you look at it, David wasn't an underdog. He came in full well knowing that he was going to kill Goliath. He stayed far away from Goliath's sword and spear and took the giant down. Something I'd like you to take away from this is whenever you stand up for God's honor, that is reflecting the faith of David. So David's zeal to preserve God's honor. We move on now to David the fugitive. After David defeated the giant and the Philistines, the people began to celebrate David more than King Saul. And so King Saul grew very jealous of David and began to just know that it was probably David who Samuel anointed to be the next king. Saul's jealousy turned into a full-out hunt to kill David. And there were several military campaigns the Bible talks about where Saul goes to try to kill David. He is unsuccessful in both of those. The picture here is a story of when King Saul is sleeping in a cave and does not know that David and his men are further back in the cave. It was a perfect moment for David to kill King Saul, but he considered King Saul as anointed of the Lord, so he just cut off a little piece of his robe, and when Saul left and crossed the valley, David came out of the cave and showed Saul that he could have killed him, and he didn't. So David becomes a fugitive, ultimately, believe it or not, ends up in the southern portion of the land of the Philistines, where they allowed David to live, and King Saul stopped hunting David. Now we move on to David's triumphs, and we begin with his political triumphs. When King Saul is killed in a battle with the Philistines, kind of in this area up here, David is living in a city down here, southern part of the Philistine area. Well, Saul is killed in battle, and there's an interesting story about a young guy who discovers Saul is dead, takes Saul's crown, comes down, meets David, tells David the story, and even makes up the story to make himself look better. And things did not end well for that messenger. But what ended up happening after Saul died is David became king of Judah in Hebron. That's the city right there in Hebron. So at first, David was king over Hebron, which meant he was the king over Judah and not the rest of Israel. After a number of years, when the house of King Saul eventually became so weak that it fell, then David became king over all of Israel in Jerusalem. So David becomes king over all of Israel in Jerusalem. So what David does is he moves his capital city north. Technically, Jerusalem is outside of Judah. It's in the tribe of Benjamin. Therefore, David is telling all of Israel that he is their king and he's not going to just give preference to Judah. So moving the capital north was smart politically. Also, moving the capital to Judah was strong militarily, because this was hands down the strongest fortress city in the entire region. It was so strong that King Saul had never conquered it. David ended up conquering it, and that was by sneaking in through the water shaft, because David's men could never just go up to the city alone. So here are some pictures of Jerusalem. One thing that I want to point out is that the city of David, from here to here, this is the great Jerusalem city of David, and the length of this is a mere 600 meters. So take our track, spread it out, that's 400 meters, add 200 more, and there you have the length of the great city of David. Here it shows the Gihon Spring down here, so the city had a fresh water supply. The temple area here was not there yet, so the city of David actually ended right here. And what this shows is that all around Jerusalem was a valley. So this was a natural fortress. So if an army came, all they had to do was defend this short wall, and they were fine, because the rest of Jerusalem was a natural fortress on a hill. Today, here is what Jerusalem, or the city of David, looks like in modern Jerusalem. Here's where Solomon's temple was, which is now the Dome of the Rock. All right, moving on. David's spiritual triumphs. I'm going to move through here without too much commentary. First, he brings the Ark of the Covenant, to Jerusalem. In a sense, this is bringing God's presence into the capital city, so the capital was also the spiritual capital, not just the political capital. Then God forms a covenant with David. David has a plan to build the temple, and God says, no, you're a man of war. I want a man of peace to build the temple. However, I am going to make a covenant with you. I promise, David, that I will give you secure land and rest from your enemies. Secure land and rest from your enemies. This will be a royal grant covenant. God didn't say it was royal grant. We know from the covenant that it was royal grant. And we also know, looking back, that this covenant was fulfilled in Jesus because God said, I will make your dynasty last forever. That would be the greatest blessing or gift of any king in the ancient world, an eternal dynasty. And we see that Jesus came in the line of David, and Jesus is a king who will reign forever. And so, David, you are not going to build the temple, but there is something better. You will have an everlasting kingdom.